Hi everyone, I'm Sean and I'm going to be your new bio teacher. So unit 1 is basically the rule book for everything that you need in any bio class. It's a unit that explains how you go from tiny particles like atoms to the giant big systems that you see in your own bodies. If you strip bio down to its core, life is basically chemistry but in a very specific way. So what you'll learn right now in this video is a lot of chemistry stuff, specifically the first part of the video. So let's get straight into it. Everything in our life is made of matter, and this matter is made of atoms. These atoms are protons and neutrons stuck in the nucleus and electrons which are surrounding the nucleus. The shell is surrounded by electrons which have an octet of 288, which are the valence electrons, because atoms want stability. For many atoms, stability means having a full outer shell, which is basically the 288 structure. Bonding, which is how atoms connect with each other, and we'll learn about 3 different types of bonding, but one of them has a lot of subcategories into it, like hydrogen bonds and van der Waals forces. So, to start it off, covalent bonds are when atoms share electrons. You see the underlining for co because they share electrons. These are the most strong and most common bonds inside the molecules of living things, like the bonds holding together sugar, DNA, and protein. These can be nonpolar if the electrons are shared evenly, or polar if one atom pulls electrons more strongly, which we'll see later in the example of water. And then we have ionic bonds, which are when electrons are transferred with each other. And I like to use the example of I for only I want the electrons, which creates charged ions like sodium or chloride. And a key point in biology is that ionic compounds break apart in water because water can interact with these charges. And lastly, you'll have the weak interactions, which sound less important, but they're actually very crucial for life. You'll have hydrogen bonds, which are when a hydrogen that's slightly positive gets attracted to a slightly negative atom, like an oxygen or a nitrogen. And this is essential for things like water. And lastly are the van der Waals forces, which are tiny attractions caused by temporary uneven electron distributions. One is very weak, but a lot of them together seriously matters, like in how protein folds or how molecules fit in within each other. All in all, the main idea is that the strong bonds, like I mentioned before, build the molecules together, but the weak interactions decide how these molecules behave in real life. So for this section, the main question you want to ask yourself is, why is water the main life molecule? So water might sound basic, but it's one of the most important molecules in biology because of its unusual properties that make life possible. First of all, water is polar, which means that oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen, meaning oxygen can pull the electrons closer to itself. That makes the oxygen side slightly negative and the hydrogen side slightly positive. And because of this polarity, water molecules form hydrogen bonds with each other, and those hydrogen bonds explain water's major biological properties. So, like you'll see in the image here, the oxygen molecule pulls together both of the hydrogen molecules, and since oxygen is more electronegative, that gives it the polar property and the hydrogen bonding. So, talking about water's properties, there's cohesion, which means that the water sticks to water. And this is why water forms droplets and why it has a high surface tension. So, again, for cohesion, like sharing. And adhesion is just, it's hard to remember, but it's basically just the opposite of cohesion. And adhesion means that water sticks to other surfaces. This matters in plants because water can cling to the walls of xylem tubes, which you'll learn later. When you combine cohesion and adhesion, you can get capillary action and the ability of water to travel upward through a plant, which again you'll learn about later. Also, water has a very high specific heat, meaning it takes a lot of energy to raise its temperature. So oceans, lakes, and other bodies of water need more temperature to stay more stable. Water also has a high heat of vaporization, meaning it takes a lot of energy for water to evaporate. That's why sweating cools you down, because when sweat evaporates, it removes heat from your skin. So basically, water resists temperature change, like it says on the screen right now. And like I said before about the sweat, it's making sure that there's no overheating in your own body. Third of all is ice. So when water freezes, the hydrogen bonds lock water molecules together into a structure that spreads them out. This makes sure that ice is less dense than liquid water. So ice will float on top of the lakes, and that layer of ice is like an insulation so the water below it doesn't freeze completely. Basically, water expands when it freezes, which creates the blocks of ice that we see, which makes sure that ice is less dense than liquid water because it expands the water molecules. And this creates insulation that can protect ecosystems in the winter. Also, water is a really great solvent, and it's called the universal solvent because it can dissolve many substances. It dissolves ionic and polar compounds, which matter because cells rely on dissolved substances to transfer nutrients, remove waste, and carry out chemical reactions. Basically, most cellular chemistry happens in a watery solution. So, what is a solvent? As you may have been able to tell based on what I just said, a solvent is a
water
substance
is not
that
just
dissolves
something that life
other
happens to be
substances,
sitting in,
which is why water
like the
is a
ocean.
universal solvent because
Water
dissolving so
actively
much.
creates the
Water can
conditions
dissolve
that allow
salt,
our living
water
systems
can
to
dissolve
function.
a lot
It has
of
so
things
much, like
because
moving on to our
adhesion,
second
dissolving
topic,
liking,
is
water
pH,
is polar,
and
and
a lot of
nature is
things
a
are
high
supposed to
voltage
keep
heat.
conditions
It's the reason that we're
stable
able to
inside your
function
systems.
right now. So, we're going to be talking about pH and buffers here, which is another major chemistry idea in Unit 1. pH is related to how acidic or basic a solution is. pH is basically a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration, which you'll see written as H plus ions. The more H plus ions you have, the lower pH you have, which means that it is acidic. So basically, all you need to remember is that pH and H plus ions have an inverse relationship, and a low pH is a high H plus, and a low pH means it's acidic. So the lower you go on the pH scale, the more acidic you are. The higher you go on the pH scale, the more basic you are. And also, the lower you go on the pH scale, the more H plus ions you have. So you might be asking, why does pH actually matter? It matters because in many biological molecules, especially proteins, depending on the environment being in a certain pH range. If the pH changes so much, parts of a protein can gain and lose charge because the amino acids itself gain or lose the charge. And this can alter or change the protein's shape. And since protein's shape are linked to protein function, a pH change can make an enzyme stop working properly, which can disrupt the whole biological system. So, how do you mediate this? You use something called a buffer, which are substances that resist changes in pH. Buffers basically soak up extra H plus ions when there are too many, or release H plus when there are too few, which helps keep the pH stable. Another classic example is the buffering system in our own bodies, specifically in blood, which resists the changes in pH. It helps keep the pH in a very narrow range so the enzymes and cells, like I mentioned before, the proteins, can function normally without too many changes or gain or losses in charge. Moving on, we need to talk about carbon, which is the backbone of biological molecules because it can form many stable bonds. So, the main thing that you hear carbon in is things like carbon dating, which is finding the age of different plants, because carbon builds everything in biology, and you can see so much just by looking at the bonds in carbon. The main reason that carbon builds everything is because it has 4 valence electrons. These valence electrons mean that it can form 4 covalent bonds. And this makes carbon really flexible and allows it to create many different variety of things like straight structures, branch structures, and rings, which creates the skeleton of most organic molecules because there's such a variety that carbon can do. And that's why carbon is one of the atoms that's in basically everything, and you'll hear that more later when we talk about the other 3 that are in almost everything. But the arrangement of these carbon atoms actually matters because their structures can lead to totally different functions. And that's where you'll hear something called an isomer. Isomers have the same molecular formula but have vastly different arrangements. And in biology, that difference can completely change how a molecule behaves. So there are three different types of isomers that I'll talk about. There are structural isomers, which have different covalent arrangements. There are cis-trans isomers that differ in the arrangement around double bonds, which can also affect shape. And there are enantiomers that mirror image isomers like left and right hands. These are important in enzymes and receptors and are very shape specific. So basically, carbon gives life an insane variety of molecules, and that variety helps build complex structures and perform complex functions. But the shape of where you put the carbons gives the different functions that give vastly the different complexities in our systems. And finally, we'll come to the biggest part that actually builds cells: macromolecules. So I'm sure you've heard of all of the macromolecules, but you haven't realized that they're named macromolecules, and you haven't realized that they actually create most of our systems. Our cells are built from these macromolecules, and each of these cells are connected by smaller subunits. So there are monomers, which are building blocks, and a polymer is a chain of many monomers. So so the four major macromolecules that you learn about are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates are things like cellulose, proteins are things like enzymes, lipids are things like the phospholipids or steroids, which I'm sure you're more familiar with, and nucleic acids are our DNA or our RNA that you see in our body, obviously. So let's go back from the top. Carbohydrates are built from monosaccharides like glucose. They give quick energy, short term storage, and structural support like cellulose. Proteins are built from amino acids. Their shape comes from folding, and this folding determines their function. Proteins do basically everything. Enzymes speed up reactions. Transport proteins move substances. Structural proteins support cells, and signaling proteins send messages. Lipids are not true polymers but are still major biological molecules. They include fats for energy storage, phospholipids for membranes, and steroids for hormones. Nucleic acids are built from nucleotides. DNA stores genetic information, and RNA helps us use that information to make proteins. Also, ATP is a nucleotide used for energy transfer, which connects genetics to metabolism. So, to wrap it up, Unit 1 is the foundation of biology, where we learned about atoms forming molecules, water creating environment for life, pH maintaining stability, carbon creating diversity, and macromolecules building the structure and functions of living organisms. So I showed all of the building blocks of life, and I like to think of Unit 1 as the Legos of life, or if you were young and you did those building blocks with the ABCs, that's what I kind of like to think of Unit 1 of biology like. It's all from the same foundation, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thank you guys so much for watching my first video. And I'll try to be active and finish all of biology as soon as I can. Thank you guys.